Welcome back to Wake Up with Nubian Tigers Talk, a podcast brought to you by a group of Black Princetonians where we talk about issues impacting our Black communities. So Ray, today we're going to be talking about some disturbing news coming out of the New York City jails. Many people know Rikers Island is one of the worst pretrial detention facilities on the East Coast. Before COVID, advocates were making pretty good progress towards convincing the city to shut it down, and then COVID happened.
Yeah, that was a big part of the current mayor de Blasio's campaign. But, Michelle, recently Rikers has been in the news because of the exploding incidents of suicide among the detainee population. And with us today are Katrina Peters and Deborah Jordan, and they're going to help us talk about the mental health crisis among the detainee population.
We are welcoming to the show for the first time, Deborah Jordan, class of 75. Deborah received her BA in psychology from Princeton, a master's in psychology from Fordham University, and her ABD in clinical psychology, also from Fordham. Debbie is enjoying retirement now, but before she retired, she was the chief of mental health services for Kingsborough Psychiatric Center in New York, where she provided leadership for the admissions unit, the continuing treatment unit, and the geriatric unit. During one part of her career, she also worked for New York City Department of Health Prison Services, where she provided initial evaluations, mental health determinations, and crisis intervention for inmates at Rikers Island and the Brooklyn House of Detention for Men.
And Dr. Peters, Michelle, has been on the show a couple of times before, but for those who have not, listened to her before or heard her before, Dr. Peters has received her medical degree from Howard University College of Medicine and UC Berkeley School of Public Health. She's the clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco, Zuckerberg, and San Francisco General Hospital, and has been on their clinical faculty for over 20 years. Currently, she is the medical director of inpatient forensic psychiatry at Zuckerberg, San Francisco General Hospital. She's also the president of Alameda Contra Costa County Medical Association, say that 3 times fast, and her local chapter of the California Medical Association.
All right, so both of you sisters have experience working with a population that is in custody. Can you each tell us a little bit about how you have worked with pretrial detainees? And Debbie, since you're the first time on the show, let's start with you.
Well, thank you, Michelle and Ray. It's an honor to be here. I think that when I worked for the Department of Corrections, I did mental health pre-screenings for inmates who generally were referred by the correction officers because of what they considered to be bizarre behavior, or if the inmate had a significant mental health history. But in order for us to know that they had a mental health history, there had to be an initial medical screening. I mean, all inmates theoretically should have been screened by a medical professional, usually a nurse, as to their physical history as well as their mental health history. But once they came to the intention of the mental health unit, we screened to see whether or not they needed to be referred for psychiatric medication, whether they needed to be housed separately in the mental observation unit, and whether they needed to have continuous follow-up, even if they were in general population. So that's the nature of the services that were in effect at that time. I think that currently, it seems that there's not as much of that going on as there needs to be, clearly, because of the recent suicides there. That is just absolutely unacceptable. It's incomprehensible that that people are dying, committing suicide, in those numbers in a city correctional facility. But the reason for that probably is lack of resources that are being devoted to that population. And it's really criminal, to coin a phrase.
Right,
yes,
right.
yes. Yeah.
So we're going to come back to those resource issues in a subsequent question, because it's really an interesting question. how much resources are we willing to dedicate to our population, particularly the pretrial population that is merely being detained and not sentenced. So Katrina, let's move to you and give us an idea of what kinds of experiences you've had dealing with that population.
So there's two ways in which I have interaction with that population. Primarily, my inpatient unit that I have at San Francisco General is a unit for patients who are in custody. And in fact, there are patients who are basically pretrial detainees. They also, so they may come to my unit at any point where they meet the criteria for an involuntary psychiatric hold. So as Dr. Jordan has said, you have where people are screened when they first come in. And sometimes, even if they have a history, they may not be acute enough at that time that they need emergent psychiatric care. But there are some people who, while they are being evaluated, they may be very intoxicated. They may be, quite frankly, suicidal or psychotic, and they may immediately get placed on a psychiatric hold and sent to my unit. Other times, people may come to the unit because during the time while they are in custody, they may develop where they become more depressed and then may become suicidal and may actually do something to harm themselves, or maybe they were taking medications and they refuse to take them, or there are many other circumstances that happens. But basically, once they reach an emergency level, then they would come to my unit. Or the other place where I sometimes work was the psychiatric emergency services. And that is a place where patients are sometimes who have been arrested are initially taken because there's some concern about whether they are too acute psychiatrically to be booked into the jail.
Let me ask you both. When you're doing your screening, did you come across, or should I say, were there certain conditions that seemed to be common among the population, or was each one so different that you wouldn't be able to categorize it as such?
Well, I think in New York anyway, we have to look historically at the deinstitutionalization, which happened back in the 80s, which supposedly was going to divert funds to the community to treat psychiatric patients.
Let me get some clarity, Debbie. You're talking about the deinstitutionalization of mental health facilities?
Of psychiatric hospitals, inpatient services. As I say, the theoretical idea was to divert that money to the community and to put resources into the community so that psychiatric patients could live there as opposed to being on locked wards in the psychiatric facilities. But of course, the resources never made it where they were supposed to go. And so a lot of psychiatric patients wound up on the streets, which brought them to the attention of law enforcement. And so a lot of times, in New York anyway, the jails substituted for the psychiatric hospitals. And it certainly was an unfortunate situation because, of course, the jails, especially places like Rikers Island, are very demoralizing, dehumanizing places. And even those with the best, most intact psyches would have difficulty, navigating that system, just being exposed to that system. But, there were an inordinate amount of people with psychiatric histories that came into the correctional system, whereas in the past, they would have been on a psychiatric unit.
What about you, Katrina? You find the same?
Yeah, I find the same. In fact, this is something that I talk about a lot and try to bring to the attention of those who are planning for mental health resources for communities. We have to acknowledge, as Debbie said that over the last 50 years or more, there has been a steady decrease in the number of inpatient beds and community placements for people with serious mental illness. Let me refer to SMI or what have you. And for an example, California was the first state to have the state mental hospital system. And it was basically to take people out of jails and prisons. And being the first to start it, we also were the first under Reagan to start to deinstitutionalize. And again, as Dr. Jordan says, we now have a situation where no one is really taking responsibility for the actual needs of these patients to be able to successfully care for them in the community. Additionally, many of serious mental illnesses, people have a state where they don't understand or accept or have insight that they have a serious mental illness. And so therefore, at some point in time in their history of their illness, they may have to be treated involuntarily. And being treated involuntarily is a very difficult situation in terms of for being able to do that safely. And if the laws of your particular state don't make that easily to do, then you have a situation where people may be treated briefly in an emergency room, maybe even inpatient, but as soon as they are not acute, they are then discharged out to the community where they can relapse again. Once they get into the jail and criminal system, and again, as Dr. Jordan described very eloquently about how people are out in the street, they don't have really adequate places to live and to be cared for. They're sitting ducks for police intervention, and they get into trouble. And so even though they have some programs such as that we have behavioral health court and drug diversion, there really is not enough treatment that our communities have chosen to take, and enough housing, especially in these urban centers, that we're able to keep these people from being under the eye of the police. And then once you get into the jail system, because of certain things about the criminal justice system, it becomes very difficult to get out of that loop.
Thanks.
And
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Debbie.
No, I was just going to ask if it's the case in California, Dr. Peters, that involuntary treatment can be sought for inmates in the correctional system, because that does not exist in New York. So if you have someone on medication, on psychotropic medication, or who should be on psychotropic medication, and they're refusing the medication in the jail system, they just don't get medicated. Nobody's going to take the effort to take them to court,
I'll explain how that works. You're correct, but there are certain circumstances under which they can be treated involuntarily. There's the temporary situation where they are placed on involuntary psychiatric hold, 5150, 5250, et cetera, and they may be treated on a unit such as mine, and they may regain, their behavior may be more acceptable. They may be better cooperative. But once they go back to jail, you're correct. There is nothing that they can be treated involuntarily specifically for that. However, there are two instances under which we do have involuntary treatment. One is if a person is considered incompetent to stand trial. And if they're incompetent to stand trial, and especially if it's due to their mental illness, then the court can order involuntary treatment with the goal of supposedly restoring that person to competency, which could include medication. But that still doesn't necessarily completely answer the needs of the patient. Once they become competent to stand trial, then they can stop taking their meds again, which happens pretty frequently. Also, we can't enforce medications actually in the jail. They have to come to the hospital if they won't take the meds voluntarily. The second situation is patients who they decide are not restorable to competency. And so they can't just leave them in the system. So then there's a process about converting them to community or civil commitments, conservatorships. And in that case, they can petition the court for, again, for involuntary medication. But again, while they are specifically in custody in the jail, there's not a way, because the jails are not approved places to give involuntary medications. Again, they would have to bring them to the hospital to get those medications. So there's just so many things that where the laws that we have, where on one hand, we don't want people to be, their rights to be taken away to live independently. But on the other hand, many of the patients, at least that we see who fall in this, don't have the insight to understand their illness and how it destroys their lives when they're out.
Debbie had referred to Rikers Island early on in our discussion. And after years of no reportings of suicide, Rikers reported 5 suicides in the last 9 months. And between July 2020 and September 2020, there were over 500 reports of self-harming. So Debbie, Katrina, what pretrial conditions might cause an inmate to contemplate suicide?
The majority of our inmates in New York and Rikers and Brooklyn House of Detention and in all of the city correctional systems are Blacks and Puerto Ricans. You know, if we want to talk about the conditions in which they lived, in which they grew up, that certainly may have contributed to whatever brought them into the correctional system. You know, that's a precursor. Okay. And if you throw in prior psychiatric histories, sometimes significant schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, personality disorders, histories of trauma. And we all have histories of trauma being Black in this country. And so just the degradation that people are exposed to on a daily basis, you know, that's the background, that's the backdrop. And so you throw them into a deplorable place like Rikers Island that's overcrowded, you know, and we don't really talk that much about the impact of possible sexual activity that goes on, homosexual rape at times. And of course, if that is happening to an inmate, they're not likely to, you know, report that, certainly not to the mental health person, certainly not to the correctional officers. But, you know, that happens, that goes on in our jails and in our prisons. And so just the dehumanization and the fear, you know, there is a lot of fear, understandably, you know, that one would experience being thrown into that kind of context, that environment. You know, so all of these things play a part in the despair and the depression and the hopelessness that inmates certainly feel. You know, those who attempt suicide or engage in self-harming behavior, certainly those things would be pertinent for their status at the time.
Katrina?
Yeah, there are, as Debbie says, there are so many instances, but we already know that when the highest risk of suicide is usually in the first 24 to 72 hours that people are arrested. And that's because, one, there's the trauma of being arrested, 2, of not knowing what's going on. Usually at that point, they haven't been arraigned yet. They don't know what's going to happen. 3, if they were on some kind of drug or alcohol, even if they aren't like overtly intoxicated, they may be withdrawing. They may be having other unanticipated problems. Then there's the other reality. Especially we're talking about women, a significant number of women who are arrested are mothers. So they don't have access to their children. Sometimes they went through something traumatic where the children were removed from them, in the process of the arrest, being able to contact their families. So there's so many things that happen just in the first part, the trauma of being arrested. Then you have other things that happen along the way. As Dr. Jordan is saying, there could be not just sexual assaults from their cellmates or the deputies. There also could be assaults or other actions with their other cellmates or cellies where they're assaulted or not getting along or what have you. So there's just trying to interact and deal with that situation. Other triggers may be sometimes people may find out that relatives have died, their family, significant others, while they're there in jail, and there's not anything that they can do about it. So there's so many other human things that you can think about that can be a real strain and a real stressor for people who are who've been placed in custody. And then when you're in a facility that's as unfriendly as Rikers Island, I was reading at certain points, they didn't have, there's no temperature regulation. People were there in the heat, or in the summer, the heat was still on. I mean, there were so many other than just physically dealing with the food. You don't have any anything on your books that you can go to the commissary. So you have to deal with whatever so-called nourishment that they give to you at the prison. So there are a lot of stressors, even for people who've been in jail before, that can be triggers for where there may be an increased risk for suicide. And like I said, some of them you can almost anticipate when you know certain times during their trial or pre-trial that they're going to be at higher risk.
How would being put in solitary confinement impact that risk?
Well, I mean, it depends on the individual makeup. I mean, some people are put in solitary for their protection and they're happy to be there, and because they would be at risk, for Lord knows what from the other inmates. I remember having, child predators in that category. They definitely wanted to be in solitary confinement. But when it's a punitive condition, when they're put in solitary because of their behavior, that's a totally different story. And of course, the isolation would add to the other stressors that one would experience in being incarcerated, and not having the interaction with your peers or even with officers for the most part. That really would cause someone to feel depressed and cut off and hopeless. And those are situations and circumstances and emotions that do lead to suicidal and self-harming behaviors.
So going back to the increase in suicides in Rikers, it also coincides with COVID-19, the onset of COVID-19 over the last year and a half. And, with you ladies talked about overcrowded conditions and lack of ability to isolate and inadequate medical attention. So other than that, is that surprising to you? Or did you expect that because of the pandemic?
Well, I think that one aspect that would contribute to that because of the pandemic, would be the lack of visitors, the lack of visitation from families during the COVID pandemic. So that contributed to the feeling of being bereft of loved ones, of contact with family and friends, and contributing also to more of the sense of isolation and the hopelessness and the despair. And then also, the fear, I guess, of contracting COVID-19 in those horrendous conditions, the onslaught of stress and terror really could certainly have contributed to the increase in suicidal behavior during that period.
Katrina?
I would like to also just want to reiterate what Dr. Jordan was saying about isolation, particularly for women. Remember, the significant number of women who are incarcerated are mothers. And as when you said you went and visited there, some, have to go to Rikers or have to go to whatever jail, wherever the women are, if they're cut off from all their children coming to visit, they're cut off. It's much more difficult for them to even have phone calls or what have you to be able to communicate with them. So it was particularly stressful, I think, for many of the women, particularly those who were mothers, to have to cope with the limitations that COVID had. And it's true for everyone. And it wasn't just the family and friends. Even the attorneys weren't going to the jail for a while. People had to communicate only on Zoom or when they could. So it's been very difficult. Even for us here now in the hospital, our hospital ward, even now, there is no in-person visitation for the patients who are on my unit.
I want to circle back around to the question of resources for a minute, because resources is always an issue when we're talking about the incarcerated population, even when they're pretrial detainees. Not, some people don't care about inmates after they've been convicted. They just throw their hands up and say, well, they did a crime, they should be punished. But the population that we're talking about is pretrial. They haven't been found guilty of anything. They've just simply been arrested. And so I'm curious, from the mental health perspective, why is there this resistance to providing resources for this particular population? In mental health in general, but also for the pretrial detainee population.
Is that not a rhetorical question?
Well, it could be rhetorical, but I mean, so from your perspective as people in the field, where's the biggest resistance in society to providing the resources necessary to deal with the population? Who's resisting that the most?
I'm gonna, I think this is certainly a larger and broader topic, but I'm gonna repeat what one of the doctors that I used to work with, not on this unit, and this was how he got out of jury duty. He said they were arrested, so they must be guilty. Now, although he was saying that tongue in cheek, I do think there is a significant part of that in the general population that does not differentiate between those who have just been accused of a crime and those who've been convicted of a crime. So, and then in the general mental health field, I have to keep reminding them that you have a significant part of your community that you're supposed to be treating who at some point in time have been in custody and have some ties to the legal system. That's invisible to them. And in fact, right now I'm looking out my window and I can see the community unit right across, right across the way from me. It's like on another wing, but I can see, well, we might as well be on the moon.
It's not like these people don't come from our communities, right? I mean,
that's the point. They do come from our communities. And as we all very well know, there's not an abundance of resources coming our way. And then when you add to the fact that, these are the disenfranchised, these are the people, who should be locked away. The community, the larger community perceives that it's safer for them to have these people locked away. And so why should they waste money and resources and staff on these people who are getting their just desserts. I mean, I think that's the mentality.
I always find that fascinating because eventually they're going to come out.
I'll tell you what I find fascinating.
Correct.
I'll tell you what I find fascinating is that when I visited the times I visited Rikers Island, there were no white inmates there.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody I saw was black or brown.
Yeah,
Everybody.
exactly.
And if you have the
Exactly.
means, you don't have to spend any time in institutions and places like Rikers Island.
Right.
Because
right.
you can post BAIL.
Because you can post bail. And it's the whole suicide COVID combination has been fascinating because for 3 or 4 years, the social justice advocates were trying to get cash bail eliminated so that people who were simply being warehoused at Rikers and other city jails simply because they didn't have money could be released from prison, released from the jail pending trial. So that they could, because they haven't been found guilty of anything. And for a while, we were seeing some success in that area.
Turn them loose, Bruce.
Yeah,
Bruce
is way after Bruce Wright, right? But this is so in the past, this is during the Blasio administration, and initially the judges were actually complying with the no cash bail situation, but now we find that many of these inmates who are committing suicide are in there because the judges have gone back to posting these ridiculously high bails, right? So
I don't know are aware of the situation we have out here in San Francisco where, they want to recall our current DA because they believe he's too soft on crime or what have you, because he's been a big proponent of trying to either no cash bail or to have people to make the decision that people can post bail. Because, previously, a lot of times there'd be situations where you couldn't even post bail. And although that's appropriate in sometimes it's not, okay? I think that society is really torn right now about what we want. Because at the end of the day, it's not like judges act completely on their own with no input from the communities. The communities decide who they want in jail and who they don't.
Yeah, but that's so easily manipulable. So for example, when the cash bail advocacy was successful and people started being released, the New York City Police Department immediately began a disinformation campaign to show that people were getting released and committing more crime, and it simply wasn't true. And even just recently, with the, everyone's afraid that with defund the police, there's an increase in crime, not to mention the fact that no police have ever been defunded. But, it's interesting to pose. One day, de Blasio showed a graph. New York's at the lowest crime rate in the past 5 years. And 45 minutes later, the then Governor Cuomo released a statement saying that there's a crime wave going on.
That's right. That's right.
So both of those can't be true, but
at the same time.
At the same time, right?
But he was the one who was probably perpetrating.
Yes, he was the criminal.
Yes, he was the criminal.
But it's just interesting.
Yeah, Cuomo had no credibility.
Yeah. But it's just interesting how if the public, sees a 5-year-old killed, and of course, they don't want that to happen. Nobody wants that to happen. But why is it happening is different from, the other social justice reforms that are trying to be accomplished. And I do think a lot of times the pretrial detainees bear the brunt of that because the public sees them, they're encouraged to believe that they're dangerous. And so, of course,
they're criminals.
Yeah.
One question to you, Debbie and Katrina. Do you guys when you're sitting down and you're talking to these people who are either in pretrial or who are part of your unit that you have to interrogate or talk to or what have you, do they share their issues with incarceration with you? I mean, do you get a sense of what it is that they're going through, and how can you guys individually help that person?
Good question.
Well, when I was working in the correctional facilities in New York, we would meet regularly with the inmates who were on the mental observation unit. And we developed a relationship with them so that it would be more likely that they would open up and really talk about what they were experiencing. When people were just coming in because the correction officers felt they were acting strangely, or well, in some instances, there were inmates who would come in because they were drug seeking, but they would be less likely to be open about their experiential circumstances, because, you know, the ones who were drug seeking were looking for medication, and so they weren't necessarily very introspective. I think it depends on whether or not the inmate felt safe enough to share. And certainly if there were a question of possible retribution from correctional officers, for example, if there had been some untoward interaction, that it's very unlikely that that would have come to our attention. Yeah, so they have to be circumspect about what they're reporting to us as it relates to, you know, the circumstances of being in the jail.
So my situation is a little different in that a lot of the patients that I see or are sent to my unit also probably get diagnosed with serious mental illnesses. And so a lot of times there are things that are happening to them or they perceive as happening to them at the jail, but often it winds up being at a more delusional level. And so sometimes it becomes difficult to separate out what's actually going on there for them and what's part of their illness and how they interpret it. There are grievance forms. In fact, one of the deputies today handed me a form that I don't even handle, but because of some other situations, he felt it was better handled by me because they have a complaint procedure, but probably for patients or inmates who are not seriously mentally ill, it becomes more complicated when they submit those forms, because people aren't going to just say that, oh, this is just delusional. There may be an element of reality that was there, but it was so out of the ordinary of what someone who is not suffering from serious mental illness might write, that he could not even figure out how to deal with it. Now, that being said, they also are complaints that they can raise if there's a complaint of where they've been sexually assaulted or inappropriately dealt with by the deputies. And if that complaint happens, there's a whole big protocol they have to go through. But again, I don't think that it represents all of the people who are being assaulted or being inappropriately dealt with in the jails, because I think that some of those inmates are very afraid to write anything and say anything, and they may only hear about it after they're out of jail.
This reminds me, as so many of our shows do, of the iceberg in our conversations. I mean, the big issue really is what's the situation of mental health in our communities, period. Right. Because people who are in pretrial detention are just a segment, one of the segments of our communities. And hopefully, I know people don't like to talk about mental health issues because it's scary, but particularly now, as a result of COVID, you see so many people acting outside of themselves, if you want to put it that way.
Well, in some cases, they are acting exactly like themselves.
It's an issue.
So I use that again, outside.
It's an issue that we need to be thinking about, maybe talking about a little more thoroughly. But at the moment, I want to thank Dr. Katrina Peters and Dr. Deborah Jordan for being our wonderful guests today and spending a few minutes talking to us about
Thank
a
you.
population that's important to us, but that people
Mhm.
don't really care about. And we want people to start caring about this population. So
Yes,
sisters,
because
thank
they
you.
are us.
They are
Yeah.
us, and they're
Right.
from our
Yes.
communities, and they are our relatives.
And they're,
and everything
and
else.
you might be one of them because there is nothing to keep
That's right.
from being arrested. I had a
Right.
doctor of mine who was arrested last year on some bogus something or another and had to spend the night.
Driving while black.
Yes,
You know,
absolutely.
we all do it.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
so we're all susceptible
We
and
are.
vulnerable.
And who knows what that trauma would cause us to do in
Oh,
our
I'd
own
lose my
lives.
mind.
Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
150.
I don't even want to think about it.
Yeah, yeah. All right, sisters. Well, thank you so much for
Yes.
joining us. This,
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you,
Thank you
Katrina.
for having
session,
us.
and we'll
Thank
have to have you back again. Katrina, we're gonna have to start paying Katrina soon. she's
Oh,
just-
she didn't get
She's
the
there
wake up.
every week.
She didn't get the wake up t-shirts I sent her. Oh, I'll have to check the UPS. You know how that DeJoy is, Louis DeJoy. Everything is all jammed up. Michelle, since the January 6th insurrection took place at the Capitol building and involved many members of law enforcement and the military, we wanted to get the perspective of Black military veterans of that dramatic incident, as well as their own personal experiences being Black in the military. Alicia Christie, Princeton class of 77, and David Steigman, class of 75, will be the guests on our next podcast.
If you enjoyed what you heard today, visit our website, nubiantigerspodcast.com. In addition to the podcast, we also post a resource page for each subject to provide additional sources of information. Follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @NubianTigers, written as one word. We're also on YouTube on the Nubian Tigers podcast channel. Our podcast is hosted by Anchor FM, but if you have a favorite podcast app, we're probably on it. Just look for the Nubian Tigers Talk. Looking forward to sharing some knowledge with you next time.
Wake up, wake up, wake up.